Hello, my name is Bill Evans. I am a faculty member here in the Department of Economics at the University of Notre Dame. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities. We're a research center that is interested in evidence-based solutions to poverty, and we get that evidence by partnering with local social service providers and run impact evaluations of the programs designed to either move people out of poverty or trying to lessen the impact of poverty on their lives. So a big component of our work has been in the homeless sector. So we've have a number of different projects on homelessness completed and ongoing right now that hopefully can help inform this difficult problem.
Could you maybe provide the top 3 reasons why California is having the worst homelessness in the country right now?
So a couple of things about California first. California they have high rates of homelessness in San Francisco, Santa Clara County, Los Angeles in particular spots. It's not high everywhere though. And so you really want to kind of separate those cities. The other thing you want to know about San Francisco and Los Angeles is that homelessness there is so much more observable than it is everywhere else, because among the homeless, there are 2 broad groups: those that are sheltered, they're living in a homeless emergency shelter, and those that are living in the unsheltered environment under bridges or in encampments or on the streets. What makes Los Angeles and San Francisco so unique, not only in the numbers, but those numbers are so visible because so many of the people are unsheltered. So New York actually has really high on homelessness rates, higher than LA and San Francisco. Well, just in numbers, they're much higher, and the rate is higher than LA. I think it's lower than San Francisco. But most of the homeless in New York City are sheltered because New York has a right to shelter statute. And so over time, they've built a tremendous amount of shelter capacity. So part of the reason why homelessness seems to be so much more of a problem in LA and San Francisco is because the homeless are so much more observable. They're living on the streets. They're there when you go to work, when you go to a restaurant. The shelter capacity in those 2 cities is incredibly low compared to, say, New York. The other unique thing about the homelessness problem in those 2 cities is, especially in San Francisco, the fraction of the population that is estimated to have serious mental illness or substance abuse problem is incredibly high. There's a lot of families in New York. There's a lot of older single males in LA. In San Francisco, the fraction that have these difficult, debilitating conditions is incredibly high. So as a result, when you see them on the streets, it's very different situation than you would see in other cities. So then the question is sort of, why is the problem so bad? The observable component is just that these cities haven't invested in shelters. The sheer numbers are a bunch of different facts, and some of them all start with the cost of housing. So housing is very expensive in San Francisco. It's incredibly expensive in LA. And the availability of very cheap housing is just not there. Now, that ends up to be an incredibly important consideration for a family that, say, is abandoned by a spouse or someone that's lost their job. Affordable housing is going to be incredibly important for them. If they have a difficult time finding it, they're going to find themselves homeless. For the individuals who find themselves on the street because of their mental health condition, their disability, their substance abuse issue, even very large changes in housing costs aren't going to help them as much. I think the big problem in those cities comes in is when there's a shock that occurs, the safety net is just not there. because of the housing costs. So if you were to lose your job, say in South Bend, you could live cheaply in South Bend because housing prices are so small. But in those two cities, it's incredibly expensive, and so that safety net is not there. So why does this matter? Well, California, thankfully, doesn't have much of a drug poisoning death rate. The opioid crisis seems to have eluded them. However, it has a reasonably high drug abuse rate. And so if someone has a substance abuse problem, it's going to be awfully tough for them to find affordable housing if they're unable to work or whatever the case may be. 2009, there was an initiative that was passed at the state level that removed a number of people from prisons and put them out in the street, put them on parole. But there was no effort to sort of help job training or job skills with this group. And since they have a difficult time finding work, homelessness rates are really high among people that have been incarcerated. When there's no social safety net, when there's very little affordable housing, that's what's going to cause a problem. So I think there's some unique situations in those two cities, and they're exacerbated by the fact that housing is just so expensive. So when you throw on substance abuse, mental illness, and released prisoners, and there's just no affordable housing or very limited affordable housing, the problem is just going to escalate. I mean, one interesting thing about those areas is that there's one argument that LA County and San Francisco City have been reasonably hospitable to the homeless over time. They've allowed encampments, they've allowed people to live outside. They didn't roust them like, say they did in New York City under Rudy Giuliani. And so as a result, it encouraged some people to migrate there. So I think San Francisco has more migratory individuals that are coming in to live there. Certainly the weather helps in that situation. So there might be some of that as well.
Could you share some numbers about the percentage of people on the street, the unsheltered homeless who have mental illness and or drug addiction?
So I think the number in San Francisco is about 2/3 of the homeless in San Francisco have a serious mental illness or substance abuse issues, which is incredibly high. It's, I think twice the rate of what it's in New York City. So I mean, one interesting question is, why is that a problem? I mean, the drug use rate in California is in the top, say, quartile of states. If you take a look at the fraction of adults that report that they have a substance abuse problem. So it's not off the charts. So the question is kind of, I think that's where the interaction with the housing prices ends up to be really important in that context.
Why is the percentage of people with drug addiction and the mental illness so much higher in San Francisco compared to New York City?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there is some migration to, say, San Francisco, that people move there because they want a particular lifestyle, or it's become hospitable to be homeless. There's been, it's really hard to measure. We can measure it reasonably well, say, in the veterans population, because they're using services, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of migration among veterans. But the population in San Francisco is a little bit younger, I think. And so I think some of it might be migration. But I think that's a really interesting question. Why is it that there is such a high mental illness and substance abuse rate among the homeless there compared to other areas? It's really off the charts in San Francisco.
Yeah, I noticed the percentage of homeless, you already alluded to that, the percentage of homeless individuals who are individuals without a family is also higher in California compared to New York.
Yeah, much higher, especially LA. LA is a lot of single individuals. So
yeah, so that may have played a role in people using drugs. Another thing that I want to ask you is you wrote a paper in 2019 on NBER, and you reviewed a lot of homelessness prevention strategies. So could you tell us a few strategies that worked and a few strategies that definitely failed to work?
So the way I like to think about this is that not everyone enters homeless the same way or for the same reasons, and not everyone has the same stock of human capital when they enter homelessness. And so as a result, the way in which they're going to either prevent them from entering it or move them out of it has to be very different. So for example, if you're a family, the husband is left, you find yourself unable to pay for your apartment and you get evicted, that's a very different situation than, say, a veteran that has PTSD that's unable to work. And so the strategies have been very different for each of those groups. And so it's not going to be able to transfer one for the other. So for example, we learned some time ago through work by Dennis Culhane that most people are entering and exiting homelessness at a fairly rapid pace, but most resources are spent on people that are chronically homeless. And so from that, we had to devise some strategies of how to deal with the chronically homeless. And permanent supportive housing seems to be one that's very successful for this group. You're provided a voucher for an apartment. You are receiving supportive services from the VA or a local social service agency or whoever might be running the house. That has proven to be incredibly successful for reducing homelessness among the chronically homeless. Probably the best success has been in the Veterans Administration. There's been this aggressive program called HUD-VASH, these vouchers. There's been over 100,000 of them that have been distributed, and our work suggests that for every voucher that's distributed, homelessness falls by one among the veterans. Now, part of it is they can recycle the vouchers. And so if there's some movement out of it, 20 or 30% of the population is going to get an apartment out of themselves. Some people are going to voluntarily leave. Then I can use the voucher on someone else and turn that person from homeless to in a permanent supportive housing. That type of system has shown to be incredibly effective for those that are really difficult to house, people that have permanent disabilities, people that have been long-term unemployed or serious mental illness. That's been a very successful program. Some things that haven't been demonstrated yet to have much of an impact are things like rapid rehousing. So the notion of rapid rehousing is, let's take a family that's lost a job, can't pay the rent. Let's try to prevent them from going into a shelter by giving them a voucher to get them moved quickly into some sort of temporary but better residence than, say, having children in a shelter. There's been some efforts to evaluate those. The evidence is less than compelling, but there was much of that has been due to, say, maybe a design element of the program, that there was this treatment group, they were getting rapid rehousing, and the control group ended up getting a lot of supportive services anyway. And so it's not clear why the program didn't show stronger results. It might be that a lot of people in the control group were already getting treated. One thing that we have demonstrated in our work in the past is that there's some preventative measures that seem to be important. So emergency financial assistance seems to do a pretty good job of preventing people from entering the homeless system. So if you are behind on your rent, you're at a threat of getting evicted and then they're moved to homelessness, a small infusion of cash, if it can solve the problem, then that is demonstrated to reduce homelessness. The problem with emergency financial assistance is it ends up to be poorly targeted, and that most people who don't get assistance don't end up homeless anyway. And so you're decreasing the chance that you're homeless, but it's off a very small base to begin with. So, there's some evidence out there of programs that are actually making a difference, but we still need to figure out whether rapid rehousing is working, especially for young families, and people that have the ability to work, it probably should be a pretty good solution. We're just, still trying to work through some social experiments on that to generate what evidence we have.
Thank you for sharing that. So in terms of permanent supportive housing, that's the housing first movement, which became very popular starting at the end of 1990s and especially in the early 2000s. And I read a lot of papers on that, and then I recognize the outcomes, some of the successful outcomes, especially in terms of housing stability, keeping people housed after 2 years or 3 years. But in terms of other outcomes, for example, reducing drug addiction, housing first seems to produce very disappointing results.
Yeah, so permanent supportive housing is a version of housing first. There's other versions of housing first, like rapid rehousing and things like that. So part of the promise of permanent supportive housing was that there was going to be this human return. We were going to house people, and so therefore we're going to prevent sort of the harms of that. But then there was thought to be there was this fiscal return that you were going to reduce some of the other costs associated with homelessness, like rearrests. You're going to improve employment opportunities. And you are correct. I would say that the evidence has suggested that there hasn't been that fiscal return on the permanent supportive housing. Now, I think the best and largest permanent supportive housing program has been in the HUD-VASH. And there has been some work that's taken a look at medical care costs in the HUD-VASH program for veterans that are participating. And that evidence is suggesting that there's some reasonable cost savings associated with it. So is that going to be universal? It's not clear, but at least some of the supportive programs in the Veterans Administration that are trying to improve housing outcomes, like some emergency financial assistance, seem to be generating some results there. So it's still something we want to take a look at. The other thing is that we found in a lot of social experiments is that it takes a long time for results to show up. And so if you take a look at Moving to Opportunity, which took people from public housing, gave them a voucher, they were supposed to move to low poverty neighborhoods. There wasn't much short-term return. There was a huge long-term return, though, for the children of that. And the same thing could be true in permanent supportive housing. So it'd be great to take a look at the people who were involved in some of these larger permanent supportive housing initiatives a long time ago, track these people over time, see exactly where the outcomes are 10, 15 years after. Because it could be that the problems are so endemic for them, their disabilities, their things that are constraining their work might take a long time for that to really make a difference.
Right. So you already mentioned housing price in California is very high, and then that has played a role. So in terms of permanent supportive housing, even though the government is building the housing, it's still very expensive. And according to a report by the LA controller, it costs about $350,000 to build one studio or one bedroom apartment. And it costs about $450,000 or more to build a 2-bedroom apartment for homelessness, for homeless individuals. So at that rate, if we want to build permanent supportive housing for all the chronically homeless individuals, that's about 28% of all homeless individuals. So I just did a back of the envelope calculation. It would cost us about $20 billion.
Yeah, it's, I mean, the problem, so, there was a initiative, I think it was, I can't remember what mayor it was.
It was Prop HHH.
Yeah, no, but there was a different initiative in San Francisco, and they were focusing on sort of increasing shelter capacity.
Oh, Prop C, right.
Yeah, and so the problem I thought with that one is that the people that are the homeless, they're not going to want to live in shelters, and they're not going to, and you can't live there permanently. I mean, that's not the point of the shelter. And so, I mean, it is a very difficult situation in California that, given the high rate of disability among the population that is homeless, especially the unsheltered, the thing that seems to work as permanent supportive housing, the solution is going to be expensive. And so, but at the same time, when you're going to work, when you're going to a restaurant and going to the theater in downtown San Francisco, do you want to have the homeless there along the way? And so people's got to decide sort of what they're willing to pay for. I mean, the solution to this is going to be expensive in California because of the price tag, and the price of land is just amazingly high. The other problem I think is going to be is the NIMBY problem, is where are you going to put these large shelters or large permanent apartments for people? So it's going to be expensive. There's no way around that.
It's expensive and it takes a long time because
so the building rules, especially because of that area with all the earthquake precautions and things like that, the costs are incredibly high, and it's a problem that's I do not see an easy solution. I do not see a cheap solution, and so it's going to cost a lot. I mean, the interesting thing is that the economy has done pretty well since COVID, and because it's been particularly good for high income people, the coffers are pretty full in California these days. So there's actually a reasonable flow of revenues to the state level. So they do have some resources. The question is this something they want to invest in?
And even if we spend $20 billion, as my back of the envelope calculation suggests, and housed all the chronically homeless individuals, so what if more people showed up, more people migrated to San Francisco and say, hey, we want the same?
Yeah, no, it's that is a problem. So that's always a problem. I mean, there was always a concern that there was migration across states for things like welfare benefits. There's tremendous difference in how generous some states are versus others, and there's huge differences in the cost of living. Some of that literature suggests there's not much movement because of that. So how much movement there is for homelessness, it's unclear. But I mean, I think that ends up to be a pretty, I mean, we seem to put time limits on a lot of things, in order to get Medicaid, you have to be without insurance and low income for a particular period of time before you qualify. So it put some time constraints. So I think they can probably get around some of that. But it's definitely going to pose a problem along that dimension.
Because California has a big focus on housing first and permanent supportive housing. Yep. We actually diverted a lot of financial resources at the state and local government level from building more shelters. Yeah. Right. So I agree with you. Shelters at current state is terrible and nobody wants to go to shelters. But why can't we spend less money compared to permanent supportive housing and build better shelters?
Yeah. So it's it does appear, if you just take a look at the raw trends, that permanent supportive housing has been increasing steadily for 15 years, maybe longer. And the cost of that has been expansion at the shelter level. And so that is a particular, problem. Now, again, the question is sort of where are the sources for this data, or I mean, where are the sources for these particular options? And my guess is that we're not going to have a ton of money from the federal level. So it's probably going to have to be states that are going to be the one investing in it. I mean, I was particularly disappointed in sort of the federal support for HUD-VASH. We were increasing vouchers there on an annual basis by about 10,000 for over a decade. And it was an amazingly successful program, and there was a rapid decline in homelessness among veterans, especially people with chronic homelessness. So in that respect, it was an incredibly successful program in reducing homelessness. Now, it was expensive because these are permanent vouchers. But this was a group that served for the country, and so I thought it was a reasonable investment. But then, just as the program was really making a huge dent in homelessness for veterans, we put on the brakes and we stopped distributing vouchers. So there's a stock of them out there, but the increase was really curtailed. So that was kind of a bum. And so these things go in phases, and it's maybe that you have to reach a breaking point in terms of the visibility of the homeless in order to make it worthwhile for people to invest their tax dollars in something like this. It's going to be expensive. I mean, there's a lot of money in the San Francisco area to be taxed in property values, but you can't with the property tax system, you can't raise a lot of money that way in California unless properties turn over. So
for economists, like we're always looking for efficiency. And to me, it just does not make much sense to build a few housing in the most expensive place in the world, instead of building more housing slightly further away from the center of the universe.
Yes, I mean I'm amazed. It's immigrants, when they come to this country, they go to where other immigrants have been, and where they've been is big cities. But these big cities are expensive, so they go to New York and Los Angeles and Houston and San Francisco. So I've always been surprised that there hasn't been more of an adventure towards lower price cities in the Midwest. And now there's some. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh. It's a relatively affordable city, and there's been an increase in, say, immigrants moving to that city as well. But it's just not it's just not the case that people move to those cities in a high rate. So I agree. I'm kind of surprised there hasn't been more movement back to some of these cheaper areas as housing prices really escalated. But the fact is, housing prices are driven by the right-hand tail of the income distribution. There's a lot of high-paid talents in the tech side in San Francisco, and they want quality restaurants, they want good retail, they want other parts of the service sector, which typically pays a lot lower than the tech sector. So you got to still staff those positions, or people aren't going to be interested in the city. So I don't know. Look, the weather in California is great, and it's a lot better than South Bend, and so people want to be in that area.
I was in Pittsburgh for 6 years too.
Oh yeah, again, the Midwest has a lot of space and a lot of cheap housing, and so
yeah, I totally agree.
If housing is an issue, people move there, but they like the weather, they like the amenities in the California area. So
yeah, definitely. I found this chart from your paper back in 2019. And then you showed, I'm not sure whether you got my list of questions where I have that. So it's just a really interesting chart where you show there is a positive relationship between rent and homeless rate, right? That makes sense. But more interestingly, you show that LA and New York City are outliers, which lie well above the regression line, suggesting that their rent does not fully explain their homelessness. And furthermore, you also showed another chart where it shows that the change of rent and change of homelessness has they have an even smaller correlation. So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so intuitively, inability to afford housing is obviously going to affect homelessness. But I like to think about it this way. that let's consider who most of the homeless are in San Francisco. These are people with 2/3 of them have a serious mental illness or some drug problem. Housing prices are really high in San Francisco. Let's cut them in half, 25% overnight. Are these people still going to be able to afford a house? Are they going to find a job that's going to be able to support this? The answer is no. And so now, is there some level that they could afford it? Maybe. But there's something about the interaction of the underlying system that they live in and the housing price that's generating this thing. I mean, so one argument was, when all the property tax revolt occurs in the state, one of the things that was really hit was the support system for mental illness. So all states have sort of deinstitutionalized the mental illness sector. There's a good argument that jails became the
asylum, right?
Reinstitutionalization of the mentally ill because they have such high arrest rates, and we've just transferred one to the other. So there is an argument that the property tax revolt in California really hurt sort of support for mental illness within the state. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's a reasonable argument that would suggest, well, maybe that's why homelessness is such a difficult issue. There's not as much support for that group. When a shock occurs, the inability to find inexpensive housing is really devastating for this population. So, I think at the basic level, prices obviously matter, but there are these other interactions that mean it's not the whole story. There are a bunch of cities where prices are really expensive that don't have the homeless problem that San Francisco and LA do. And so it has to be some interaction with these other characteristics that are sort of really what's driving things instead of just the raw price itself.
Just for an average homeless person in California or in the country, how long would they have to wait before getting a permanent supportive housing if they qualify for it?
Yeah, so I don't know how long the wait is. I mean, the wait is infinite for some people. They're never going to qualify. There's just too many people on a priority list ahead of them. There's really two problems for people that are in permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing. The first is just the time it takes you to get into that. And so that's going to be, long for some individuals. And I think that has actually gotten longer. HUD-VASH is probably a good example. Every year we're getting 10,000 more vouchers. And so therefore we're able to move more people off the waiting list onto the vouchers. But when we stop adding that, the only turnover we're getting are the people that leave a voucher for an apartment in their own name. And so that really decreases the flow of people off the homelessness rolls into permanent supportive housing. And so that's one delay that people are going to face. The other delay that's a really big problem in a lot of cities is that I could get a voucher that's going to pay me a certain amount for rent, but I might not be able to find an apartment that actually that I could afford even with that voucher. So we're doing a project now in Orlando that sort of worries about that quite a bit. And the delay that people face once they get the voucher, a lot of times people are taking 6, 7, 8 months to find an apartment that they can actually afford. Now, a lot of them have constraints. They might have a job and they need to be on a bus line in order to get to that job, or they got to get their kids into a particular school. And so those constraints really sort of bite in terms of finding the appropriate apartment for your family. But there's delays not only getting the voucher, but once you have the voucher in some of these cities, finding something that's affordable for yourself. So it can be a real problem in these very expensive housing areas.
Does the voucher ever expire?
So it expires once you use it. And so there is one problem that we've been talking to some people that run rapid rehousing programs, and the people that have the voucher understand that it's a 12-month payment. And so they're in some respects afraid to use it because they know that once they use it, they're going to going to have to pay for the apartment by themselves. And so therefore they stay in the shelter for longer time period until they can find something that they know is going to be eminently affordable, even after the voucher expires. And so there's some thought that people are afraid to cash in their vouchers because they know there's a time limit on it at the end of the time, that they only get 10 or 12 months, depending upon sort of the source of the payment for the rapid rehousing. And so we're talking to them about some ways to kind of speed up the process of moving people out and devoting more resources to try to help the search process. It's difficult for a lot of families, and not everyone wants to take clients with housing vouchers.
Yeah, so another thing that's really interesting. So you mentioned this a little bit in your paper, that the point in time data actually underestimate homelessness. Can you tell us like the scale of underestimation?
So there's two kinds of homeless. There are people in shelters and there are people not in shelters. It's relatively straightforward to count the people in shelters when we do the point in time estimate. And the shelters know exactly how many people are there. It's the unsheltered that are the big problem. And so I think, I can't remember what the estimate is. I thought it was something like 50% of the unsheltered are missed or something like that during the point in time estimate. They're about, I don't know, 50% of the homelessness. So it's probably underestimated by 25%, something along that lines. I don't remember what the exact number is, but I mean, the big problem is counting the unsheltered. And sometimes, you know, it's easy to do if there's a big encampment and that's where all a lot of homeless live. But if they're much more scattered, then it's going to be very difficult to find them and count them. Yeah, so it's a particular problem. So I mean, there's two big issues in terms of counting the homeless. One is the counting the unsheltered, and then the other one is just definitional. What do you include as a homeless person? And so if you have a family that's been evicted, and they're living with another family, they're couch surfing temporarily, they're not considered homeless in those point in time estimates. And that's an enormous component. So the number of people that are living temporarily, not paying rent with someone else, you know, like couch surfing or something like that, it is really high. And so part of it is definitional, part of it is just the difficulty of counting the unsheltered.
One thing that the government has basically put aside is to build better transportation. Because if we have better transportation, people don't have to all live in downtown in the big cities, right? So do we have any development in terms of policies to improve our transportation?
I mean, there was some discussion about infrastructure investment in the latest budget that was proposed by Biden. I don't know where that is right now. I mean, it's always a discussion. We are a car-based society. There's a lot of questions about whether lack of public transportation generates poor labor market outcomes. Homes for low-income areas tend to be segregated from where the jobs are located, so you do need some transportation to get there. So yeah, but transportation initiatives, high-speed rail or subways, whatever the case may be, are just so incredibly expensive, and they take so long to build. I lived in the DC area for 20 years, and they were building the extensions of the subway out towards Dulles Airport for that entire time we were there. It didn't open till after we left. And so it just takes a long time to make big changes like that. I think again that some of that, some people are going to be helped by that. Is it going to be a big change for homelessness? My guess is no. A large component of the homeless are people that have structural problems, some disabilities or whatever. I don't think transportation is going to help that group. I think, we're going to have to think of different ways to go about that. I mean, it could help. There could be larger effects associated with the transportation in terms of making jobs available for people that live in poor areas. That as a homelessness tool, I'm not sure that's going to be all that effective.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's going to help people who are chronically homeless and or having mental health, drug addiction problems, but it probably will help people who are doubling up with relatives and friends, people who are on the margin of being homeless.
Yeah, I think it's really hard for people to try to solve some problems in their own to their family. If you're struggling on a day-to-day basis to get food on the table, how your ability to sort of think through the problem of where is it optimal for me to live and how can I get the kids to babysitting and get to work and things like that. And so we've done a reasonable number of RCTs on intensive case management for low-income people to help solve problems for them. And these problems can be very varied from, trying to get out of community college to just trying to navigate the immigration system. And having that support system from a social service provider, I think, is incredibly important. And so trying to experiment with housing locators and trying to speed up the process by which people find new apartments and stuff like that, I think is something we might want to invest in. That might be a cheaper way to go about solving some of these problems than sort of building infrastructure, building large housing complexes again.
Another question that I have is about the Nimbi movement. So that's not in my backyard, right? And I feel like I can understand why people are against building more housing in their neighborhood because it drives down their housing value, which makes sense, right? But where's the future?
Yeah, I mean, there is no easy solution to this problem. Now, I mean, so what's happened? I mean, a lot of these homes are being built in areas that are not as well organized socially, and just in terms of having homeowners associations and things like that. And so that is going to be that's an enormous problem. I mean, it's just there are so many people that need supportive housing. It's hard to run these supportive housing with one apartment here, one apartment there. There is some production advantage of having everyone in a one apartment building, so you can have supportive services right there. Catholic Charity Chicago runs a very successful permanent supportive housing residence for veterans called St. Leo's, and it's a fairly large establishment, but that the economies of scale of doing that make sense, but it's not going to make sense to the neighbors who live nearby, and solving that problem, I don't know. The Coase theorem suggests that we can have cash transfers to people that will make them willing to take the neighborhood, so we'll prop up their housing values. So maybe that's a solution, but again, there's a lot of dollars involved in order to make this thing work.
Thank you for that. In 2016, you published a paper on science on the impact of homelessness prevention programs on homelessness, right? So can you tell us about that project?
So it was actually our first project that we did at Leo. And in this, every city has a 211 or 311 number that you can call if you're at risk of losing your home. And that call center will connect you with local social service agencies that will provide you with emergency financial assistance to help you, if you qualify, to try to keep your house or apartment. The call center in Chicago is actually run by Catholic Charities Chicago. And we just did a project with them where we took the calls that came in and matched them to records in the homeless system and the continuum of care there. Now, the sad fact is that you could call on a Tuesday and there would be resources that were available to you, but then on Wednesday morning, the resources weren't because they were exhausted. And so the very incomplete funding of these emergency financial assistance programs mean that they were always running out of money. A new one would come online, people would then become eligible. So, roughly half the people that called at a time when there was no resources that were available for them in their category, whether it's a veteran or a single mother or an single individual, whatever the case might be. And so we just used the fact that there was this high turn down rate, that people qualified for the money, but there was no money available, as kind of a control group, and compared those to what happened to people that were able to call when money was available. And we found that when you called when money was available, there was about a 76% reduction in the probability you ended up in a homeless system. So there's a big decline. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the problem with emergency financial assistance ends up to be that it's pretty poorly targeted, and that most people, even the ones that are turned down, never end up in the homeless system. And so you're paying some resources to people that would have found other alternatives, whether it's a friend or some other charity or whatever the case might be. But it was still an effective way to try to reduce homelessness. Now, in that paper, what we did find is that there was a certain income threshold for people that were eligible, and all the benefits were for people that were sort of half that income level. And so the results would have been much more dramatic if they would have, in the future, sort of decreased the income eligibility for it and concentrated the money in the lower income group. And so there's promise to sort of increase that efficiency of the program by making it much more selective. And so I thought that was the most interesting result of the paper.
I thought it was a really interesting paper. Also, it's just very nice that you guys were able to take advantage of the almost quasi-randomness of whether people get the funds.
Well, I mean, the big thing about that paper, and what's part of the success, I think, of Leo, is that we work with local social service providers. So Catholic Charities runs the call center. If we were to just call up the continuum of care, say, hey, we want access to your HMIS data, we'd have gotten a cold shoulder. But when Catholic Charities calls and says, hey, we have this project, we think it could be really helpful for us, can we match the data to it? They were very accommodating. And so that's the benefit of working with a great social service provider is really evident in that situation.
And we know that California is now thinking of adopting the homelessness prevention program as you outlined in your paper. So if you were to design this program from scratch, or if you were to give California some advice on how to run such a program, what would the advice be?
So, I mean, the problem with emergency financial assistance is the targeting. And so you want to find a group that is really at risk. And so I think there might be a better link between emergency financial assistance and the eviction courts. And so if you take a look at the homelessness rate of people that have been evicted, it's enormously high. And so they have such a high probability of being evicted, of ending up in the homeless system once they've been evicted, that if we somehow better link the information between those two systems, we would have a highly eligible population that's very targeted in terms of being at risk, and you would have much better outcomes for the dollars that you're spending. And my colleague Rob Collinson has this great work about what are the consequences of eviction by following people that have gone through eviction court in Chicago and New York. And there are some judges that are more pro-tenant, there are some judges that are more pro-landlord, and he uses that variation to sort of estimate what the context of evictions are. To me, one of the more interesting results in the paper is just the high fraction of people that are evicted that end up in the homeless system. So there is a really at-risk group. And so one thing we can do is like, well, let's prevent evictions, and then conditional on an eviction, let's see if we can sort of get them into a new apartment, give them some financial assistance so they can pay for security deposit, first month's rent to get them into a new apartment. And because I think that's a real at-risk group. And so to make emergency financial assistance a really effective program, you need to target this better. And I think that's one way to do it.
So in order to do this targeting better, we need better data, right?
Yeah, no, I mean,
better linked data across
yeah.
different systems. And then, so why is it so difficult for county government to share their data with researchers?
Well, it's not just county government, it's state governments. I mean, there is this big data revolution, and the real important results are going to be found when we take a bunch of different disparate data sets and start putting them together. As a researcher, we're always using administrative data. We're going to departments of education or departments of health or vital statistics and trying to get information. And the phrase that you never want to hear is, let's get the lawyers involved, because then that's going to slow things down. And there's a lot of very sensitive information. People are very cautious about making this information available. And so the act of linking, say, one data set from a housing agency to another data set in the healthcare system, it's just a very difficult thing to structurally do. But sort of the returns to doing something like that, on a preventative basis, I think would have amazing returns. We saw this, there was some of this in some respects during the opioid crisis. So a lot of the opioid crisis was doctors overprescribing medicines. Some states were in these interventions where they identified sort of the prescribing practices of doctors, and then had interventions that were designed to discourage them from being as willing to write opioid prescriptions for their patients. And that seemed to change things in some of these interventions. So that was kind of an interesting use of using data to identify where to target. I mean, we could educate every doctor, but that's not going to be very useful. You have to educate the doctors that are actually overprescribing. And so I thought that was an interesting way to go about doing it. Doing this on a larger scale and something like this, again, you're going to have a lot of parties involved. But at some point, what you need some elected official to say, this is important to me, and I want this thing to get done, and then people snap to. And so until that happens, it's going to be tough sledding, because you're going to get the lawyers involved. So
I have one last question.
Yep.
So in your 2007 paper, Cops and Crime, you and your colleagues found that a bigger police force funded by COP grants significantly reduces burglaries, auto thefts, robberies, and aggravated assaults.
Yep.
So can you talk about that work and its implications in today's defunding the police environment?
So, the demonstrations that occurred after the George Floyd events in 2020 generated a lot of calls for things like defunding the police. My guess is there was no more politically unpopular movement than defund the police. I was actually chatting with someone today who was talking about that as maybe sort of the worst designed public policy initiative of all time, because it was incredibly unpopular. The movement to defund the police is I think, lost a lot of steam as the violence that has taken has occurred in cities in the post-lockdown era is just staggeringly high. So we had a very long-term decline in murders in this country, and that's all reversed. There's been about a 30% increase in murders from 2019 to 20, and it looks like we're on about a similar pace between 20 and 21. And so the violence that's just racking, especially major cities, Chicago, New York, Atlanta, Seattle, and I don't think there's much stomach for defunding the police right now. At the same time, I don't think there's much support for expanding the size of the police force. And so, I mean, one solution to reduce crime is to increase the size of the police force. If you take a look at what's happened at per capita police in the nation as a whole, that's actually declined over time. And even in areas, expanding the police force in election years is a popular item at the city level, but even those changes are relatively small. So I don't think there's much interest in defunding the police. I also don't think there's much demand for the police force to expand either. The big problem, I think, in a lot of this is really just the gun violence associated, especially with young males. There's a lot of guns out there. COVID generate a lot of free time. There's a lot of alcohol and drug use. And so you take volatile situations and you throw a bunch of handguns into it, and you're going to get a lot of murders. And a lot of it is not necessarily, crime or murders associated with crime. It's just someone has a disagreement and they settle it with a gun, and so there's a ton of violence associated with it. So I think the defund police movement, the violence associated with it, has lost a lot of steam, especially with the rise in murders in big cities. I also think it's not clear that there's a lot of stomach for a massive increase in police force either. And again, I mean, the big problem there is we just have this enormous stock of guns, and it seems to be relatively easy for young people to get guns. They have them at a relatively high rate. So the question is how are we going to deal with that problem? And that's a very intractable problem. We got to somehow encourage people to give up their guns, which they don't necessarily want to do. That one's particularly devastating because the numbers that we're seeing in 2020, 2021 in terms of the increase, we've erased a good 15 years worth of declines in violence. We're not approaching the violence that we saw during the crack heyday, but it is getting really, really high. A lot of crime is property crime. And when everyone's home all day, you can't break in and enter houses because you're going to get caught. And how do we steal cars? We steal cars by going to parking lots and stealing them when they're at the shopping mall or at a football game. Oh, we didn't have that for a long period of time during COVID, and that's still down. And so the opportunity to commit a lot of property crime has actually gone way down in some respects. But the violence is just out of control. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Well, this is really great. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you so much. This is
Thanks so
great.
much.
Thank you. I
Okay.
appreciate it.